Hello and welcome to this special Thanksgiving edition of Zilog and Moto as we inch closer to the end of Season 4 and the next edition of the Zilog and Moto Year in Review. Something I always enjoy putting together as I look back on all the great and not so great games that I've looked at this year. Boy, 4 years of doing these reviews, that's pretty crazy. What am I doing with my life? Now, if you're a returning viewer, you already know, but for everyone else here for the first time, welcome, and I will tell you what I'm doing with my life and this channel. Zilog and Moto exists as an all-encompassing look at the English language libraries of Sega's 8 and 16-bit consoles, the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Basically, if you can play it on a Genesis with some sort of adapter and I can read what's on the screen, I'm going to try to obtain a copy for the collection, and then look at it inside and out and share those results with all of you. Okay, let's get started with this week's video, which is based on a game that is a foundational building block of the 90s arcade scene. And that game is Arch Rivals for the Genesis. For those of you that are confused by that statement, or that maybe have never heard of Arch Rivals, let me explain. As you can probably tell by looking at the cover, Arch Rivals is an arcade basketball game, specifically with a 2-on-2 setup for 1 or 2 players. The arcade version of the game made its debut in 1989, and then it was followed up with a port to the NES in 1990, before that version was released for the Genesis in 1992, along with a Game Gear version and a Master System version that was unfortunately canceled at the last minute. And that's too bad, because I think based on what I've seen of that Game Gear version, the Master System version could have probably handled a decent rendition of the game, and I think it would have been very interesting to do a direct comparison to that NES port. Getting back to things that actually exist, however, the arcade version of Arch Rivals was a bit of an underground hit for Midway. I remember specifically the first time that I played the machine, it was totally by random chance, as it wasn't in an arcade, but instead at a laundromat. Yes, you heard that right, a laundromat, land of all the best arcade machines. Now, normally when I was younger, I didn't hang out in places to wash your clothes, but for some reason, I think maybe our washer was temporarily broken, my mom took me to a new place that she'd heard about on the University of South Carolina campus called Suds, which was designed to be a cool laundromat, where the students could hang out, waste time, and maybe get a snack while waiting on their clothes. They had 2 arcade machines at the time for that purpose, and I think maybe Road Blasters was the other one. I don't really remember, because the one that drew me in was Arch Rivals. And for all the quarters that I had, which I don't remember if it was enough to play a full game or not, I was highly entertained. What drew me in about the game, though, was that it was wholly original. The only basketball games that I'd played to that point were either your standard 5-on-5 type games, which usually try to be at least somewhat realistic, or mano-a-mano setups like one-on-one Dr. J versus Larry Bird. I'd never seen anything before that had the same speed and action that Arch Rivals had, amongst all its other original elements. I wouldn't ever say it's the best arcade game ever, but it's definitely one that I always enjoy when I see and play it. So, what about this Genesis version then? Does it live up to its arcade roots? Or is it just a cheap acclaim port? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Arch Rivals for the Genesis. And as you can see from the outside, it's in really good shape, with the outer cover holding up really well, and no scratching or scuffing that I can see, and the hang tab is intact at the top of the case. Along with the outer case looking good, the inner cover is in more or less perfect condition as well, with no water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear anywhere to be seen. Just a great example of what this would have looked like in an electronics boutique 30 years ago. I don't remember when I picked this copy up, or how, but it hasn't been traditionally too hard to find, and its going rate on price charting reflects that, with complete copies currently going for $20 to $25. I might have specifically ordered it on eBay just due to my history with the game, but I'm pretty certain that I probably just picked it up in a resale shop at some point. As you can see from the front cover, Arch Rivals is not your average basketball game, with the action seeming to come directly from the ridiculous pages of Mad Magazine rather than something like Lakers vs. Celtics. Personally, I think this is a fantastic cover. I'm not sure who supplied the art for it, if Acclaim reached out to artist Brian Collin, who had done the design work at Midway for the arcade game, or if this was something that they just came up with in-house. But either way, I think it does a great job of encapsulating what made Arch Rivals great, and while you can't really tell who these other players are supposed to be, clearly this one character is Mohawk, one of the 8 players that you can choose to play as. Also, I'd like to point out that Arch Rivals came out long before Dennis Rodman signed with the San Antonio Spurs and started experimenting with dyeing his hair, so I don't want to hear from anyone that Midway ripped off Dennis for the character design. Oh, and just in case you were curious, the NES version uses almost the exact same artwork, except with one minor difference. In the NES version, the game had sponsorship from surprisingly not defunct British Knights, who somehow is still in business and selling ghastly-looking sneakers in 2022. The Genesis version didn't retain that sponsorship, so the shoes, which actually do resemble BK high tops from the era, had their labels whited out, and the banner in the back was replaced with an Acclaim banner, which was pretty bizarre to see because the whole reason that the Flying Edge division of Acclaim existed briefly was so that Acclaim could get around an exclusivity deal that they had signed with Nintendo and release games on Sega platforms. Interesting way of Acclaim giving Nintendo the finger there. Flipping over the back, and I like this layout. So Acclaim, Flying Edge, is batting 2 for 2 here. 4 decent varied screenshots are present, each with their own caption and some decent flavor text over to the side. I especially like this section. Tonight, there's no fouls. What? No fouls? That's right, no fouls. Like it was something out of some cheesy commercial. Opening up the case, and unfortunately, the manual got a little bent on the edge at some point, but other than that, it's intact. And if you notice, they goofed on the cover of the manual, and hey, the British Knights are back. Makes me wonder if they ever fixed this, and if there's actually 2 different manuals floating around out there, because the Game Gear version of the manual is correct. As far as the contents of the manual go, it's a decent short manual. Not much to explain here, but there is some nice original art included, and I especially like the short player profiles for each of the characters, which is a nice touch and goes beyond what you normally see in-game. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see just how well this port compares to the arcade. To compare a game to an arcade version, usually I just go to YouTube and look for some decent quality video that someone had captured of them playing the game. This usually works pretty well. I mean, I'm not actually playing the arcade game, so I can't truly compare how the games play, but normally it's good enough for the review purposes for me just to have an idea. Sometimes, depending on the game, I do go the extra mile and boot up the game in MAME or the appropriate emulator, but that's usually only if I feel like there's something specific that I need to test out. For Arch Rivals, there's actually an easier solution, so that I wasn't have to rely on foggy memories of the arcade game from years ago. Back in 2012, when Warner Brothers owned the rights to the Midway properties, they released a collection called Midway Arcade Origins, which has 31 classic Midway games included, and one of those is Arch Rivals. And thankfully, Midway Arcade Origins is available for modern Xbox consoles, so if you want to play some of these games without having to mess around with an emulator, it's a really great value, especially if you catch it on sale like I did. The result was twofold. One, I really got to see firsthand where the Genesis version came up short against the arcade version, and two, I realized that as much fun as Arch Rivals was in the arcades in 1989, it definitely had its own issues, and it's clear why it was more of an underground hit while NBA Jam took over the arcades 4 years later. We'll get to those problems in due time, but let's discuss the game itself first. Arch Rivals is a 2-on-2 basketball game for 1 or 2 players, with either one player taking on the computer or 2 players going head-to-head, but no co-op mode. Arch Rivals isn't intended to be a serious game of basketball, and instead has its cartoonish graphics and humorous elements that are present throughout the game. With that being the case, the game features no kind of licensing either from the NBA or the NBA Players Association, so the game is 100% fictional, and once you start playing the game, you'll understand why that's the case. Instead of actual basketball players, Arch Rivals has a roster of 8 characters, each having an individual look and description. Based on those descriptions, you would think that the different players would have specific strengths and weaknesses. For instance, the character of Lewis is described both in the game and in the Genesis manual as being a top shooter, and due to that, I traditionally always chose him as the character that I played as. However, I've got to say, I think the descriptions may be more for show than anything else, because in working on the review and playing both the arcade and Genesis versions of the game, I picked a few different characters to play as, and none of them really seemed any different. So it's possible that there may be some small differences between the characters when it comes to attributes, but honestly, I think you can just kind of choose the character that you like best and go at it. When you choose your character and your opponent chooses theirs, if you're playing in 2-player mode, the computer will then choose a partner for you automatically, and then also the entire opposing team if you're playing in 1-player mode. The only thing that you get to choose other than your character is the name of your team and the opponent's team, and possibly the colors for each team. The reason why I say possibly is because team choice in Arch Rivals is probably one of the worst things about the game, at least how it was implemented. By default, the arcade and Genesis versions feature the following 4 teams: Chicago, Los Angeles, Brawl State, and Natural High, and each team can appear in one of 6 uniform colors. Not bad for an older arcade title, and at least you had some options. Unfortunately, the problem comes when trying to pick which team should play which and what colors they should be wearing. Instead of easily being able to toggle between the teams and the colors, the game uses a system where you slowly, one by one, scroll through the different matchup options, hoping to get the team and look that you want. I don't understand at all what they were going for with the system, and it's pretty infuriating to just have to sit there and wait as the screen draws the new matchup each time until you get what you want. This is where I'm going to lodge my first complaint against the Genesis version. Keep in mind, the Genesis version came out about 3 years after the arcade version, so Flying Edge/Acclaim had plenty of time to work on the port. Rather than fixing this obviously broken system of team choice, they decided to port it exactly the same way it was in the arcades. As a rule, I definitely want my arcade ports to be as close to the original game as possible, but I think someone with some common sense should have stepped in here and said, maybe this could benefit from having a better menu system. Also, not only did they not fix this, but one of the cool things about the arcade version was that arcade operators could customize each of the 4 teams. So you could theoretically be playing on a cabinet that featured South Carolina, Clemson, Duke, and Michigan State, instead of the generic teams. Of course, this customization option wasn't brought over, so it truly ends up being the worst of both worlds. Moving on, there's the actual game, and if you think it looks similar in concept to NBA Jam, you'd be correct. And in fact, what I'd say is that NBA Jam is simply a refined version of Arch Rivals. The game features simple controls, with one button being used to take or block shots, and then one button being used for passing the ball when on offense, and then punching when on defense. That's right, in Arch Rivals, you don't just try to steal the ball from your opponent, you jack their jaw and then pick up the loose ball to go on a fast break. It's every bit as ridiculous as it sounds, and it's just stupidly fun. The only drawback I can see to the controls is that the players feel slightly floaty when they move around the court, which can make lining up punches or just playing defense in general a bit tough. And the same goes for on offense if you're trying to get to a specific spot on the floor. And just in case you were curious, it absolutely does matter where you're on the court to shoot, as wide open shots are going to be much more likely to go in than contested ones. As far as what there is to do in the game, well, you can play basketball, and that's about it. And I'm sure you're probably thinking, well, it's a basketball game, so why is that controversial? And technically it's not. In the arcade version, all there is to do is play basketball as well, and the Genesis version at least improves on that by obviously not requiring you to put in quarters to extend your time and keep playing the game. Where I'm going with this is that, just like with team selection, the game ported over directly from the arcade version and nothing is added to it. So what happens when you get tired of playing games against a computer if you don't have someone to play against? The game has no season or tournament mode to try to give the player something to achieve or work towards. It's just exhibition after exhibition. And on top of that, the game has no options. So once you get good at the game and are beating the computer with ease, and you want more of a challenge, well, too bad. In this regard, the Genesis version being just a straight port of the arcade game seems incredibly short-sighted, seeing as how it desperately needs something to aid its replayability. And not being able to change the difficulty level, something else that the arcade version supported, is head-scratching at best, and it just reeks of Acclaim trying to make a quick buck off the license. Another area where the Genesis port of Arch Rivals isn't quite up to par is the graphics. I mentioned artist Brian Collin earlier, as he was responsible for the look of the original arcade game, and someone that's familiar with his work can easily look at Arch Rivals and tell that he worked on it, as it has the same cartoonish style that he's known for in other games like Rampage, Xenophobe, and Pigskin 621 AD. And those cartoonish graphics, especially the players, is where the arcade version gets a lot of its charm from, with fun little details here and there. Unfortunately, some of that great art doesn't come across in the Genesis port, and to Acclaim's credit, it's only partially their fault. The reason for that is because Arch Rivals, the arcade game, was designed to run on an arcade monitor that has a higher resolution than just a regular CRT TV. As a result, it's natural that some sacrifices were going to have to be made, with redrawn art on the home version to fit the lower resolution. And some things look okay, like the cut scenes between made baskets and quarters. But during actual gameplay, it's impossible to look at the game and not see this as clearly a washed out, lower detail version with smaller sprites, which is disappointing considering that the original arcade hardware that Arch Rivals runs on is actually pretty similar to a Genesis in spec. Along with the original artwork in the arcade version, the game was somewhat notable for its sound as well, with some choice speech sound effects included, with the player shouting things like "pass it" and "I'm open" during gameplay. This, along with some lively crowd noise and cheering, and some atmospheric background music that at times is clearly arena organ influenced, make for a soundtrack that gets you immersed in the action, and as much as anything else was a harbinger of what would come later with NBA Jam, specifically Tim Kitzrow's various sound bites. And to Acclaim's credit, I think the sound holds up better than the graphics, with most if not all of the speech and sound effects included. The background music doesn't have quite the same punch, no pun intended, as the arcade version, but it's not bad and could be far worse. By now, if you've watched and listened to most of this video, you're probably thinking that I'm not going to give the Genesis port of Arch Rivals a very good score. And to be clear, it's definitely a step down from the arcade version, with less options, graphics and sound that aren't quite as good, and some needless censorship, with the cheerleaders being reduced from a D cup to a B cup, I'm assuming at Sega's urging. And I didn't even mention that the AI in the Genesis version is brain dead, making the game a cakewalk after you figure out the controls, and killing single-player replayability in the process. But it's still Arch Rivals at its core, and it's still by far the best home port of the game from the era. As a result, I'm giving Arch Rivals for the Genesis 2 stars. It's a bare bones as can be port of the arcade game that begs to be played in two-player mode, but it's still an enjoyable game that is a clear precursor for the NBA Jam series. Okay, that was Arch Rivals for the Genesis. I want to be clear, I love the idea of Arch Rivals, and the arcade machine is always going to hold a special place in my heart. And the Genesis version is fine if you want to scratch that itch occasionally, and it plays well, and it has the same gags that the arcade version does, with needing to avoid the nearsighted referee and or trash on the court, the ball bouncing and rolling around on the rims at times, and it does allow you to break the backboard if you dunk it just the right way. But don't pick this up expecting to get a lot of playtime out of it by yourself. It's just not that type of game. Next week on Zilog and Moto, I'll be staying on the Genesis and playing a game that I've never played before, and actually I don't know very much about it. I think I know what genre it is from the screenshots on the back, but even that I'm not 100% certain about. And it's also going to be a slightly somber video, as I've specifically picked it out on the schedule due to a recent unfortunate event which has occurred, which I'll talk about briefly as well. And due to that, I'm really hoping that this game is going to be better than I'm expecting. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 177. If you liked what you saw here and you want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone!